By the summer of 1945, a remarkable industrial empire stood idle across the English Midlands, the north of England, and beyond. Stretching from Coventry to Castle Bromwich, from Bristol to Birmingham, from Crewe to Chatterton, dozens of enormous manufacturing complexes had, over the previous 6 years, poured out Spitfires, Lancasters, Merlin engines, tanks, and munitions on a scale that would have seemed impossible to the planners who first conceived them in 1935. Covering millions of square feet of factory floor, employing hundreds of thousands of workers at their wartime peak, these were the shadow factories, purpose-built arsenals of democracy that had quietly won the Battle of Britain and helped smash the Wehrmacht. Now, with the guns silent, 3 questions hung over every one of them. What were they for? Who did they belong to? And what on earth should be done with them next? The shadow factory scheme had been the brainchild of the Air Ministry and the Board of Trade, conceived in the mid-1930s as an answer to a deeply uncomfortable truth. Britain's existing aircraft and engineering manufacturers were efficient but small, their capacity utterly inadequate for any serious continental war. The solution was elegant in its audacity. The government would build and own entirely new factories, then arrange for established companies, Austin, Roots, Rover, Bristol, Daimler, Standard, to manage and operate them. The state bore the capital cost. Industry supplied the management. By September 1939, the first wave of shadow factories was already producing Bristol Hercules engines and Spitfire components. By 1943, a second and third wave had expanded the scheme to cover tanks, guns, and a bewildering range of ancillary equipment. At peak production in 1944, the Castle Bromwich aircraft factory alone was completing some 320 Spitfires per month, making it the single most productive fighter manufacturing facility in the world. In total, the shadow scheme encompassed roughly 50 principal factories, representing a government capital investment of some $175 million, approximately $8 billion in today's values. What the Attlee government inherited in August 1945 was therefore not merely a collection of vacant buildings, but a staggering industrial asset, representing a fundamental question about the post-war British economy. The factories were government property. The machinery inside them, lathes, jigs, presses, precision grinders, was, in most cases, government property too. The managing companies had contractual rights, institutional knowledge, and a workforce they wished to retain. Veterans were returning from the front, expecting employment. The transition from war to peace was not a moment of quiet reflection. It was a logistical emergency conducted at the speed of demobilization. The immediate challenge was one of conversion, and the Ministry of Supply moved with considerable urgency. Within weeks of the Japanese surrender on 2 September 1945, cancellation notices had gone out on contracts worth hundreds of millions of pounds. At the Roots Shadow Factory in Brighton-on-Dunsmore, Warwickshire, production of Bristol Hercules engines ceased almost overnight, and the vast floor space was repurposed almost immediately for motor vehicle assembly, the Hillman Minks rolling off lines that had recently manufactured aircraft power plants. The transition required retooling on a massive scale, but the fundamental infrastructure, the covered floor area, the electrical supply, the transport connections, the trained workforce in the surrounding communities, was precisely what the motor industry needed. Elsewhere, the shadow factories became anchors of the post-war nationalization program. The Castle Bromwich aircraft factory, having delivered a Limahl 694 Spitfires over its wartime life, was acquired by the Nuffield organization and subsequently passed to the newly formed British Motor Corporation, eventually becoming a major body-pressing plant for Austin and Morris vehicles. It remained in automotive use for decades, its wartime identity slowly absorbed beneath decades of peacetime production. The Austin Shadow Factory at Longbridge, Worcestershire, had produced aero engines and military vehicles. After 1945, it was folded directly into the expanding Austin Motor Company, contributing significantly to that firm's post-war capacity to export saloon cars across the Commonwealth. If you find this deep dive into British industrial history interesting, do consider subscribing for more explorations of the overlooked stories behind the modern world. The Bristol Aeroplane Company's shadow establishments presented a more complex picture. The Filton Works, expanded enormously under the shadow scheme, retained their aviation purpose. Britain still had an aircraft industry to sustain, and the emerging jet age demanded manufacturing capacity rather than less of it. The same logic applied at Chatterton in Lancashire, where A.V. Rowe and Company's shadow capacity fed directly into post-war production of the Avro Lincoln, and later, the Avro Vulcan. Here, the shadow factories did not so much convert as evolve. The distinction between wartime shadow and peacetime production facility dissolved as the Cold War created new demand for advanced aircraft. By 1950, Chatterton was once again working at high intensity, this time on V-bombers rather than Lancasters. The fate of the factories engaged in tank production followed a different trajectory. The Nuffield Mechanizations facility at Doddington Road, Birmingham, along with the Leyland Motors shadow establishments, found that peacetime demand for armored vehicles was a fraction of wartime production. The British Army of the Rhine still required equipment, and the Korean War of 1950 to 1953 would generate a brief burst of renewed demand, but the scale of production never approached the wartime figures. Many tank-related shadow facilities were quietly returned to civilian engineering purposes, their distinctive wide-span roof structures and heavy floor loadings making them suitable for heavy manufacturing, and eventually for distribution and warehousing as the decades passed. The human story was equally complex. At peak production in 1944, the shadow factories employed approximately 1.65 million workers across all establishments, of whom a significant proportion were women, recruited in vast numbers from 1941 onwards to replace men called to military service. The end of the war brought an enforced and, for many, unwanted transition. Women workers were systematically displaced as returning servicemen were given priority employment under government policy, a process that was economically convenient and socially controversial in equal measure. The reabsorption of 4.5 million demobilized servicemen into the workforce between 1945 and 1947 proceeded with remarkable speed, aided in no small part by the ready availability of converted shadow factory employment. But the women who had driven much of the wartime production effort were largely written out of the subsequent industrial story. The disposal and liquidation branch of the Ministry of Supply handled the formal transfer of assets with considerable efficiency. Government-owned machinery from factories that did not convert to civilian production was catalogued, valued, and either sold to managing companies at negotiated prices, sold by tender to the broader industrial market, or, in a smaller number of cases, exported under trade agreements. Precision machine tools in particular, many of American manufacture, supplied under Lend-Lease, presented a specific complication. Under the terms of the Lend-Lease settlement reached with Washington in December 1945, approximately 19,000 machine tools of American origin had to be either returned or paid for at agreed valuation. In practice, most were purchased by the British government and subsequently sold on to industry, contributing to the retooling of the civilian manufacturing sector. Of the original 50-odd principal shadow factories, a remarkable number survived into the 21st century in recognizable form, though often under altered ownership and purpose. The Castle Bromwich plant continued automotive production until 2016, when it closed as part of a restructuring by Jaguar Land Rover, a closure that attracted considerable local emotion given the site's wartime significance. The Speke Shadow Factory near Liverpool, originally constructed for Roots to produce Blenheim bombers, became a major center for vehicle assembly and later for other manufacturing purposes before partial redevelopment. Several Bristol area shadow establishments remain active in aerospace to this day, forming part of the extended Airbus UK and GKN aerospace supply chain, a direct, if attenuated line of descent from 1930s planning. What is striking, when one surveys the shadow factory legacy from the perspective of 2026, is how completely the scheme fulfilled its post-war economic function without ever being designed to do so. These buildings were conceived purely as emergency military instruments. That so many became permanent pillars of British civilian industry reflects both the pragmatism of post-war reconstruction and the underlying soundness of the original infrastructure investment. The towns that grew up around them, Brighton, Longbridge, Chatterton, Filton, were shaped decisively by decisions taken in Whitehall conference rooms in 1935 and 1936. The men and women who worked in them often had no idea they were employed in a facility built by government decree to forestall a Nazi victory. The shadow factories were not weapons in the conventional sense. They left no battlefield wreckage, no distinctive silhouette in a museum hangar. Their legacy is embedded instead in the topography of the English Midlands, in planning records held at Kew, in the oral histories of women riveters and engine fitters, and in the unremarkable industrial estates that now occupy ground once covered by aircraft assembly lines. History, when it operates at industrial scale, does not always leave the ruins one expects. Sometimes it leaves only a postcode and a planning permission. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Britain's wartime aircraft carriers after World War II next. It explores how the Royal Navy's fleet carriers were scrapped, sold, or transferred to Allied nations as jet aviation transformed naval warfare beyond recognition. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.